Sometimes you just got to dig in deep, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you want to really get smart on something.
Especially if you want to level up your game.
And, in fly fishing, there's no shortage of stuff to learn. We
Absolutely.
all run into these puzzles on the water.
Yep.
And one of the biggest is that classic debate,
Mm-hmm.
matching the hatch
Mm.
versus, well, trying something else.
Right. Like, is that always the best strategy?
So that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're looking specifically at spring creeks
Yeah.
and those really selective trout.
Oh, yeah. Those spring creek trouts are notorious for being picky.
We've got some great sources for this deep dive into that age-old question.
Yeah, and the real question here is this. Is precisely imitating what the trout are eating always the best way to catch them?
I mean, you always hear about the importance of matching the hatch,
Oh, absolutely. Especially on those legendary waters.
like the Henry's Fork.
Yep.
Yeah,
You need the perfect fly, the exact imitation.
that's what everybody says.
Right.
But is it always true?
Well, that's what we're going to find out.
One of the sources we dug into for this was Art Lee's book, Fishing Dry Flies for Trout on Rivers and Streams.
Oh, that's a classic.
And, he talks about how Ernest Scheibert actually popularized that term, matching the hatch, back in 1955.
Yeah.
But Lee himself questions this idea that you have to be constantly changing flies all the time,
Yeah.
trying to match the hatch perfectly.
Yeah, he really emphasizes the time and the expense that
Yeah.
goes into that.
And he really questions whether that's actually the most effective or even enjoyable way to fish.
Yeah, I can see his point there. All that frantic fly swapping can take away from just enjoying being out on the water.
I mean, he even talks about his friend Ed Van Put, who apparently only fishes with like 3 fly patterns.
Oh, wow, really?
The Adams, the Royal Wolf, and the pheasant tail midge.
And he still catches fish.
Apparently he catches his fair share.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
It really makes you think about whether you really need that massive fly collection.
right. Do you really need to have every possible imitation?
I mean, I know I've definitely fallen into that trap of thinking I need the perfect fly for every situation,
Oh, for sure.
but maybe it's not always that critical.
And that really leads into this idea of the generalist angler.
Oh, yeah.
And this is something Gary LaFontaine talks about in his book, The Dry Fly New Angles.
Another great
And
one.
he defines the generalist as someone who uses just a limited number of fly patterns.
They have their go-to flies and they know how to fish them effectively.
Right.
It's all about presentation for them.
Presentation being key.
Yeah.
And, I've definitely had my share of those frustrating days on the water
Oh, yeah.
where the fish are rising all around me.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced I've got the right fly on.
But nothing's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I specifically remember this one day on the Henry's Fork.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I had the perfect mayfly imitation.
But the trout weren't having it.
They would not take it no matter what I did.
It's humbling, isn't it?
So humbling.
When you're surrounded by feeding fish, but they're completely ignoring you.
It's like they're looking right at your fly
Yeah.
and saying, no thanks.
Our sources actually had this specific anecdote about a big brown trout on the Big Spring in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
This trout was just sipping midges,
Yeah.
and the angler went through almost his entire fly box of midge pupa imitations before he finally managed to hook it.
Wow.
Talk about persistence.
But it also makes you think about how much time we can waste.
Yeah.
Stuck in this loop of, it must be the fly.
When really it might be something else entirely.
Art Lee really hits the nail on the head with this quote. No fly is right unless it's fished correctly.
That's so true.
And that's something that's really emphasized throughout our sources.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how perfect your fly is.
If you're not presenting it well,
It's not going to work.
it's all about putting that fly in the right spot at the right time and making it look natural.
Right.
Drag-free drift, the right depth, the right speed.
So if it's not always about the exact fly,
Yeah.
how do we decide what to use?
Well, Gary LaFontaine offers this really helpful framework for fly selection.
Okay.
He breaks it down into 3 main approaches: empiricism, generalism, and naturalism.
Interesting.
And these categories can really help you approach your fly box in a more strategic way.
Yeah.
So first you have empiricism.
Okay.
And this is basically drawing on your past experiences.
Okay.
It's thinking, okay, this fly worked well for me in similar conditions before.
Like on your home waters.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
you're familiar with.
You know the water well, you know what's worked in the past, so you start there.
So it's all about leveraging that knowledge and experience.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then you have generalism, which we've already talked about a bit.
Right.
This is where presentation generalization really trumps the specific pattern.
The generalist angler.
They have a few key flies that they know how to fish really well,
Right.
and they can adapt those flies to a variety of situations.
So it's about confidence in those patterns.
Yeah, and knowing how to make them work.
Got it.
And then finally, you have naturalism. And this is probably what most people think of when they hear matching the hatch.
Right?
It's about really observing what the trout are feeding on,
Yeah.
identifying the insects, their size, their stage of life, and then choosing a fly that closely imitates them.
So you're really paying attention to those details.
Absolutely.
Like what stage of the life cycle those insects are in.
Exactly. Are they nymphs? Are they emerging? Are they adults?
Right. So you might have nymphs, emergers, duns, spinners.
And you need to know what the trout are keying in on.
And I think most of us probably use a combination of those three approaches.
Oh, for sure.
If you're fishing your local stream, you're probably going to rely on empiricism to some degree.
Yeah, you've got that knowledge base built up.
But if you're on a new river,
That's when the naturalist approach becomes really important.
you have to become a student of the stream.
Yeah.
And that's true even for those diehard hatch matchers.
Even they will spend time observing before they even think about picking a fly.
So even if you're all about matching the hatch,
You still need to take the time to really see what's going on
right.
and understand the specifics of that particular river or stream.
But fly fishing isn't just about catching as many fish as possible.
No, it's not just about numbers.
There's so much more to it than that.
It's about the experience, the connection with nature, the challenge.
And both the angler, who meticulously matches the hatch,
Yeah.
and the one who confidently fishes a handful of generalist patterns.
They can both find success and enjoyment
Right.
in their own way.
It's about finding what works for you.
And what brings you joy on the water.
And, that leads us to this really interesting concept of unmatching the hatch.
Unmatching the hatch.
Yeah.
So intentionally choosing a fly that doesn't match what's on the water.
And this involves having a selection of attractor patterns in your fly box.
Oh, yeah. I've got a few of those.
Those classic flies.
Like the Royal Wolf, the Renegade, the Parachute Adams.
Yeah.
Those are some of my favorites.
And the idea is that these flies are designed to trigger a reaction from the trout.
Yeah, they might be more visible or have a unique profile or movement.
But they're not imitating anything specific.
Right.
And, these attractor patterns can actually be really effective in certain situations.
Like when there's not a noticeable hatch.
Yeah.
Or when the visibility is poor. Or even during heavy hatches.
Which might seem counterintuitive.
Yeah, you'd think you'd want to match the hatch even more closely during a heavy hatch.
Right.
But our sources use this great example of a September day on the Henry's Fork,
Oh, yeah.
where there were just tons of insects on the water.
Trico spinners, calabiate spinners.
Mahogany duns, Baetis mayflies.
It's like the buh for the trout.
And the point is that during those really heavy hatches,
Yeah.
matching the hatch perfectly can actually become a handicap.
Because there are so many naturals on the water.
Exactly.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
And not only is it tough for the trout to pick out your fly,
Yeah.
it's tough for you to see it too.
Especially with those tiny flies.
Yeah, how are you going to track that size 22 amidst all those naturals?
Especially as we get older.
Yeah, our eyesight isn't what it used to be.
So in those situations, a more visible attractor pattern can actually be more effective.
It stands out from the crowd.
It's something different that might catch the trout's attention.
And that brings us to another interesting strategy. Matching the feeding rhythm.
Matching the feeding rhythm
Yeah.
instead of just matching the hatch.
So during those heavy hatches,
Yeah.
trout might be rising at pretty predictable intervals.
Okay.
They're not necessarily taking every single insect that drifts by.
They're being more selective.
They might be taking several insects with each rise.
So it's about timing.
Exactly.
Getting your fly to the fish at the precise moment they're coming up to feed
And that often requires getting closer to the fish
to make those accurate casts.
and really timing your presentation.
Okay.
Another tactic our sources discuss is using droppers.
Droppers.
Yeah, you tie a second fly below your lead dry fly. It could be a nymph, an emerger, or even another dry fly.
Interesting.
And this can be really effective when the trout are being selective.
So the upper fly acts as an attractor?
Yeah, or it just gives you a more visible reference point,
Okay.
while the lower fly might be a closer imitation of what the trout are actually eating.
So you're presenting them with two options,
Yeah.
and they can choose.
And there's a great anecdote about fishing a gray drake hatch,
Oh, yeah.
using a Parachute Adams with a gray drake spinner as a dropper.
Okay.
And adding that dropper reportedly led to immediate success.
So they started catching fish right away.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that a big brown trout was caught on the parachute Adams.
even though there are plenty of gray drake spinners around.
So even when the correct fly is present,
Yeah.
the trout might still go for something a little different.
It's
It
fascinating.
really challenges our assumptions.
Speaking of challenging assumptions,
Yeah.
what about those skating spiders?
Skating spiders.
Yeah.
That's a fly I haven't used in a while.
Our sources talk about this technique as like a shock treatment.
Shark treatment, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And, the skating spider has this really unique tie.
Yeah, it's got that extra short shank hook
Yeah.
and that oversized stiff hackle.
And no tail or body.
It's all about that hackle.
And the presentation is just as unique.
You grease your leader and then twitch the fly to make it skate and jump across the water.
Wow.
It's really about that erratic movement.
So it's not trying to imitate anything specific.
No, it's about triggering the trout's predatory instincts.
Like a reaction strike.
Yeah, they see that commotion on the surface and they can't resist.
And, Ernest Schweibert noted that skaters tend to be especially effective when trout are used to seeing larger fluttering insects.
Interesting.
And Gary LaFontaine observed their success in imitating adult crane flies.
So it can be a really versatile pattern,
Yeah.
even though it doesn't look like much.
But our sources did mention that the materials for tying traditional skating spiders can be hard to find these days.
Oh, that's a shame. Yeah. It sounds like a really fun technique.
Let's talk about terrestrials.
Terrestrials.
Yeah, like beetles, ants, crickets.
Oh, yeah, those land-based insects.
And what's really interesting is that trout can become selective on terrestrials.
Even when there's an active aquatic insect hatch going on.
Exactly.
It seems counterintuitive,
Right.
but it happens.
And it's especially common on those warm summer days.
When those mayfly duns are leaving the water quickly.
Yeah.
And the trout might start focusing on those emergers and cripples.
Those insects that are trapped in the surface film.
But imitating that delicate movement can be really tough.
So that's where terrestrials come in.
They're a reliable food source for trout throughout the season.
Right. They're used to seeing them.
And they might even have a preference for them.
Like a secondary selectivity.
Exactly.
And there's this great article by Ken Miata called Anting the Hatch.
Oh, yeah, I read that one.
And he talks about his success using ant patterns.
Even when the trout were technically feeding on mayflies.
It's amazing.
It just goes to show that sometimes you have to think outside the box.
And I'm a big fan of the simple black beetle pattern.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's easy to see on the water.
And it can be surprisingly effective.
And, you can even add a small, bright yarn indicator to those terrestrial patterns.
To make them even more visible.
Right.
That can be really helpful.
So, after all this,
Yeah.
we have to admit that even with our best efforts,
Yeah.
we can never be entirely sure why a trout takes a fly.
That's the mystery of it all.
Right.
We can make observations, we can develop theories.
They can try different things.
But ultimately, the trout's decision-making process,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a black box.
And that's part of what makes fly fishing so fascinating.
That constant puzzle.
So to sum it all up for you,
Yeah.
it's clear that understanding what trout are eating,
Yeah,
it's definitely valuable,
absolutely.
but it's not the only factor.
No, it's just one piece of the puzzle.
You also have to consider presentation,
Visibility.
the trout's feeding rhythm,
And even those unconventional patterns like attractors and terrestrials.
and sometimes
Yeah.
simplifying your tactics
And finding ways to convince the trout to play your game.
can be the most effective approach.
So it's not always about being a perfect imitator.
Right.
Sometimes it's about being a little more creative.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder,
Okay.
given all these variables
The hatches, the presentations, the trout's behavior.
and our own ability to adapt and observe.
Yeah.
Is fly fishing ultimately more about understanding the trout,
Or about understanding ourselves.
our own tendencies, and our willingness to think outside the box?
That's a deep question.
That's something to think about next time you're on the water.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time,
Tight lines.
tight lines.
Happy fishing.
Happy fishing.